Rain hit like thrown gravel, cold and relentless, as my father pointed at the door and said, "Take your bag, and take that boy with you." I remember the way Noah's fingers locked around mine, how his small hand trembled, and how I realized in one brutal breath that I had been exiled from my own life. My name is Grace Moreno, and I didn't understand how quickly a home could become a weapon until the evening my divorce papers were signed. The ink was barely dry, my eyes still swollen from hours of trying not to cry in a courthouse hallway, and I came back to my parents' place with the kind of exhausted hope you only carry when you have nothing else left. I thought they'd at least let me sit down. I thought my mother would ask if I'd eaten, if I was okay, if I needed a minute. Instead, she looked through me like I was a mess someone else had tracked across her clean floors. My father stood near the entryway with his jaw set, arms rigid at his sides, like he'd rehearsed this moment and didn't intend to deviate from the script. My mother's voice didn't shake when she said, "We warned you." Grace, reckless choices always come due. I tried to speak, but the words stuck behind my teeth because standing beside me was Noah, soaked from the drizzle outside, thin hoodie clinging to his shoulders, eyes too old for his face. He edged closer as if he could make himself smaller, less noticeable, less trouble. That only made my mother's expression tighten. "You're divorced, you're unstable, and you're dragging a homeless child around like he's your responsibility," she said. And it was the phrase dragging that made something hot flare behind my eyes. Noah's voice came out like a thread. Barely there. She saved me. My father let out a short, humorless scoff. "Not our concern. You chose this, so deal with it somewhere else." He didn't ask where we'd go. He didn't ask if we had a car. He didn't ask anything that resembled love. He just opened the door, pointed, and ended my childhood in one motion. When the door shut. The sound didn't echo in the hall. It echoed inside my ribs. Outside, the night was a soaked blur of streetlights and puddles that reflected the world like broken mirrors. I carried one bag, everything I could salvage from the life that had just collapsed, and I held Noah's hand like it was the last rope tying me to meaning. He shivered so hard I felt it through his skin. "Are we going to be okay?" he whispered. And hearing a child ask that question as if I were the only adult left on earth nearly brought me to my knees. I forced my voice steady, because a promise is sometimes the only shelter you can build on the spot. "We will," I told him. "I promise." My throat burned as I said it, because I didn't know if it was true. I only knew I couldn't let him see the terror inside me. The kind that makes your vision narrow and your thoughts start counting worst-case scenarios like beads on a string. We walked toward the bus station because it was the only place open this late, and every step made my shoes squish, each wet sound a reminder that this wasn't a nightmare I'd wake up from. Neon signs buzzed in the distance. Cars hissed past. People inside them didn't look at us because why would they? The city has a way of hiding its most desperate corners in plain sight. By the time we reached the station, my hair had plastered itself to my cheeks, and Noah's lips had gone pale with cold. We sat on a plastic bench, sticky with spilled soda and old grime, surrounded by the hollow announcements of departures we didn't belong to. He leaned into my side, small and exhausted, and asked in a voice that tried to be brave, "Is this our new home?" I pressed my mouth to his damp hair, inhaling that faint smell of rain and cheap soap from the shelter showers, and I swallowed the sob rising in me. "No, sweetheart," I whispered. "Just for tonight. Just for tonight." I said it the way someone says a prayer they don't deserve, the way someone tries to convince the universe to give them one more day. The truth was, Noah and I had already been surviving for weeks by then, long before my parents shut that door for good. People assume rock bottom has a final floor, a place you land and stop falling, but I learned it can keep dropping away under you in quiet increments. The first time I saw Noah, it wasn't under the brutal rain or the glare of a bus station. It was a Tuesday afternoon in a crowded hospital waiting room, and I was sitting there holding a folder of legal documents, staring at the word divorce as if it might rewrite itself if I stared long enough. My marriage had been dying for months, but seeing it formalized in ink felt like someone had pressed a bruise and smiled when I flinched. I was trying to breathe through it, trying to keep my face composed in public. When I noticed a small boy curled up in a plastic chair across from me, knees hugged to his chest, hair falling over his eyes like a curtain. His clothes were torn at the hem, his shoes mismatched, and the emptiness around him looked loud. No parent leaning in close, no one checking on him, just a child sitting in a room full of adults who had trained themselves not to see what made them uncomfortable. I tried to look away. I really did. My life was already in pieces. Involving myself in someone else's tragedy felt like stepping into deeper water, while I was already drowning. But then he lifted his head, and our eyes met, and something inside me cracked open like a seam. His voice came out almost silent, as if he'd learned the world punished children who took up space. "I'm not supposed to be here," he whispered. I moved to the chair beside him before my fear could talk me out of it. "Hey," I said gently, "what's your name?" He hesitated like trust was a language he'd forgotten. Then he swallowed and said, "Noah." I asked where his parents were, and he stared at the floor and answered too calmly, too practiced. "I don't know. I lost them a long time ago." A nurse approached, eyes narrowing with suspicion, and asked, "Is he yours?" before I could even form a response. Noah's hand shot out and clutched my sleeve so tight it hurt. "Don't let them take me away," he begged, panic breaking through his stillness. "Please." I looked at him, really looked, and saw a child who didn't fear getting in trouble as much as he feared being erased. So I said the words that changed everything. Even though I didn't understand the cost yet. "He's with me," I told the nurse, and she nodded and moved on. Just like that, as if a sentence could become a lifeline. Noah exhaled a shaky breath, and his eyes glistened. "Everyone leaves," he said, not accusing, just stating a fact he'd learned the hard way. My own heart, already bruised by betrayal, tightened with something fierce and protective. I shook my head and heard myself speak with a certainty I didn't know I had. Not me, I promised him. And that was how a broken woman with a folder of divorce papers walked out of a hospital with a child who had nowhere to go. Both of us pretending we weren't terrified of what came next. Both of us needing each other more than we could admit. After that day, Noah and I built a life the way people build rafts in the middle of a storm, out of whatever floated close enough to grab. I used the last of my savings to rent a small, dim apartment that smelled faintly of old paint and reheated dinners. But it had a door that locked and a window that let in morning light, and for a while that felt like wealth. I took whatever work I could find, clerical shifts that ended before dawn, event cleanups where my hands ached from folding chairs, grocery stocking jobs that left me smelling like cardboard and citrus. None of it was steady, none of it promised a future, but it kept us fed, and that was enough to let me sleep for a few hours at a time. Noah learned the shape of our days quickly. He learned which nights I came home too tired to talk, and which mornings I lingered over instant coffee, pretending it tasted good. Every night he curled up beside me on the couch, his head tucked against my arm, and whispered things like, "Today was a good day. Grace." Or I didn't feel invisible today. And I would lie awake after he fell asleep, staring at the ceiling, promising myself I would find a way to make that feeling permanent for him. But promises don't stop the world from collecting what it's owed. The day I lost my last part-time job, I came home with a smile that felt stapled to my face, the termination letter folded and hidden in my bag like a secret I could outrun if I didn't look at it. I asked Noah about his drawings, about what he wanted for dinner, about anything that wasn't the way my chest felt hollowed out. He sat at the table coloring a picture of a house with a bright yellow window. And after a while, he looked up at me with that unnerving clarity children sometimes have and said, "Are you sad? Your eyes look different." I told him I was just tired, but he rested his head against my arm and said quietly, "I don't need toys or a big room. I just need you." That sentence split me open in a way no courtroom ever had. A week later, the landlord taped a notice to our door, the paper curling at the edges like it already knew it would be ignored. Pay everything within 48 hours or vacate. There were no more shifts to pick up, no favors left to ask, no relatives willing to answer my calls. After 48 hours, we packed one bag, just one, with clothes, toothpaste, a half-empty box of crackers, and Noah's drawing of that little house with two stick figures holding hands. Then we locked the door for the last time and left the life I had tried so desperately to hold together. The first night homeless doesn't feel like the movies. There's no dramatic soundtrack, no swelling realization. There's just humiliation that settles into your bones. The sense that everyone can see your failure even when they refuse to meet your eyes. We walked through streets lit by neon signs and silence, past closed shops and people who moved faster when they noticed us. The shelters were full, families lined up in hallways, volunteers apologizing with tired eyes that told me they'd run out of words weeks ago. By midnight, we ended up back at the bus station, sitting on the same plastic bench, our world reduced to what fit between my knees and Noah's shoulder. He leaned against me and asked, "Is this our new home?" And I told him, again, that it was just for tonight, repeating it until the words felt worn thin. Days blurred into survival. I walked miles during daylight, scanning job boards, filling out applications that asked for addresses I didn't have. Some places didn't want a woman with no fixed residence. Others didn't want a woman with a child. At night. We bounced between church basements, shelter mats, and sometimes just a corner under a flickering light where I could keep one eye open while Noah slept. He rarely complained, but I noticed the way he ate slowly, trying to make each bite last, the way he pressed closer whenever voices nearby grew loud. "Don't let go of my hand," he'd whisper, and I always answered, "I won't," even as I felt myself cracking under the weight of that promise. One evening, a social worker pulled me aside at a shelter, her voice kind but firm, the kind of tone that pretends kindness can soften hard truths. "Grace, you're caring for him well," she said, "but without stable housing, the system may need to step in." The words froze my blood. "You mean take him?" I asked, and she didn't say yes, but she didn't say no either. When I returned to Noah, he looked up at my face and knew something was wrong before I could lie. That night, as he fell asleep in my lap, he whispered, "You won't leave me." Right, I held him tighter and said, "I'll never leave you," but for the first time, I feared someone else might make that decision for me. It was on a night that felt no different from the others that Noah told me the thing that shifted the ground beneath us. We were sitting under the awning of a closed cafe, sharing a cup of instant noodles a volunteer had handed us, steam rising into the cold air. Noah stared at the cup for a long time, too quiet, and when I asked if he felt sick, he shook his head and said, "I remembered something." He gripped the cup like he needed its warmth to keep the memory steady and whispered, "My dad. I remember my dad. Noah almost never talked about his past without prompting, so my heart began to race. He told me about a big house with shiny floors, a room just for books, a black car that came every morning, and people who called his father Sir. I asked if he remembered a name, and after a long pause, he said, "I think it was Vale. Adrian Vale." The name landed heavy in my chest. I'd seen it on magazine covers, heard it whispered in conversations about money so large it sounded fictional. I didn't say it out loud at first. I didn't want to scare him or myself. But when Noah added, searching for the word, he said he was a Bill something, and his face lit up when I finished it for him, Billionaire. I felt the world tilt. This wasn't a fantasy. This was a memory clawing its way back to the surface. Noah looked at me with fear rather than excitement and asked, "If he's rich, does that mean I'll have to leave you someday?" I forced a smile and told him we'd just focus on finding the truth. But after he fell asleep, I sat awake, staring into the dark, wondering what it would mean to lead a child back to a life that might erase me completely. The next several days were spent inside public libraries and community centers, the only places where warmth and internet access didn't ask questions. While Noah colored quietly beside me, I typed the same words over and over, my fingers stiff with fear and hope tangled together. Adrian Vale, billionaire, missing child, Vale Technologies. Every search tightened the knot in my chest. There he was, staring back at me from polished magazine photos, silver threaded through his dark hair, a man who looked like he commanded rooms without raising his voice. I clicked through articles until one line made my breath hitch so sharply I had to grip the edge of the desk. Adrian Vale, founder of Vale Technologies, father of one son, presumed lost, kidnapping suspected, case cold. I scrolled down to the photo attached to the article. A small boy in a bow tie with cautious eyes and a familiar tilt to his head, and my vision blurred. The resemblance wasn't vague, it was undeniable. I looked over at Noah, asleep with his cheek pressed against his folded arms, and whispered to myself, "Oh my God, that evening." As we shared a thin soup from the shelter kitchen, I asked him gently if he remembered being called anything other than Noah. He frowned, searching through himself, and said, "Maybe Julian. It feels like a dream name." My heart pounded as I told him the truth as carefully as I could, that I believed he might be Julian Vale, Adrian Vale's missing son, instead of excitement. Fear flooded his face. "If he wanted me," he asked, voice trembling, "why didn't he find me?" I brushed his hair back and told him sometimes terrible things happen that have nothing to do with love. But even as I said it, doubt gnawed at me. Still. I promised we would find answers together, because anything felt better than waiting for the system to decide his fate. 2 days later, after counting bus fare like it was gold and summoning courage I didn't feel, we stood at the base of Vale Tower, glass stretching into the sky like a blade. Noah squeezed my hand so tightly my fingers ached. Inside. Security stopped us immediately. But when I said, "I need to speak to Adrian Vale about his son," the atmosphere shifted as if I'd struck a match. Phones lowered, whispers died, and within minutes we were escorted into a private waiting room that smelled of polish and power. Noah leaned against me and whispered that he was scared, and I told him I was too, because lies would have been useless. When the door opened and Adrian Vale stepped inside, he didn't look angry or arrogant, he looked hollowed out. His eyes went straight to Noah, and in that instant, recognition flared like pain. "Julian," he breathed, his voice breaking. Noah shrank behind me, clutching my jacket, and Adrian knelt slowly, asking if he knew him. Noah answered with a fragment of memory about a glass-walled room and bedtime stories, and Adrian's face crumpled as if he'd been struck. For a moment, the room held its breath. A father and son touching the edges of a life stolen from them. Then Adrian stood and turned to me, and something cold slid into his expression. He asked what my role was, how a homeless woman ended up with his missing child. And when I tried to explain, suspicion sharpened his words. He accused me of opportunity, of coaching, of manipulation, and when he ordered legal and security to keep us there. My blood ran cold. Noah's sobbing plea finally broke through his armor, and Adrian agreed I could stay while the truth came out. But the damage was done. I was no longer just a caretaker. I was a potential criminal in a billionaire's world. The hours that followed blurred into confessions and explanations as I told Adrian everything. The hospital, the shelters, the eviction, the nights Noah slept holding my sleeve so he wouldn't lose me. His anger softened into grief and guilt, his hands clasped tight as if holding himself together. When Noah whispered, "Daddy, I wasn't trying to run away, I just couldn't find you," Adrian broke, tears falling freely as he held his son, watching them. Relief and dread warred inside me, because even as Noah was being returned to his blood, I could feel myself being edged toward the margins. Within hours, Adrian's legal team arrived, led by Ms. Kendra Sloan, whose calm questions treated my life like a puzzle to be solved. I was asked to remain available, to answer questions, to understand protocol, and the word suspect hung unspoken in the air. By morning, headlines exploded across borrowed screens, turning me into a silhouette with a sinister narrative. A mysterious woman linked to a billionaire's missing son. Reporters camped outside shelters. And my past clawed its way back when Derek Moreno, my ex-husband, appeared with a smirk and threats, hinting to the media that I was unstable and desperate. I knew then that the storm was far from over, and that loving a child had placed me squarely in the path of forces far bigger than either of us. The hearing notice arrived 2 days later, folded neatly and handed to me by a shelter volunteer who looked away as if the paper itself might bruise. Mandatory hearing on temporary guardianship. The words blurred together, heavy and official. And even though Adrian had defended me publicly and Noah had refused to leave my side, the law still needed to decide where he belonged. The courtroom was colder than I expected, all polished wood and measured silence, a place designed to drain emotion from the air. Noah sat between Adrian and me, his small hands locked around mine with a grip that felt like panic given form. When my name was called, my legs trembled as I stood, and I reminded myself to breathe, to stay upright, to remember that the truth didn't need theatrics to survive. The judge listened carefully as Adrian spoke first, his voice steady despite the tension pulling at his shoulders. He acknowledged that I had saved his son, protected him when the world failed, but he also spoke of stability, resources, a future he could provide, and every word cut because it was reasonable and true. When the judge turned to me, I felt the weight of Noah's gaze, trusting me to choose right even if it hurt. I told the court I had never tried to replace his family or claim what wasn't mine, that all I had done was keep a frightened child safe, and that I would continue to do so in whatever way was best for him. Noah broke into quiet sobs, begging me not to leave him, and I knelt to hold his face, whispering that love doesn't vanish just because addresses change. When the judge called a recess, I stepped into the hallway with my heart in pieces, bracing myself for an ending I couldn't control. That was when a detective approached Adrian with a file and a look that made my stomach drop. New evidence had surfaced about Julian's disappearance, a witness coming forward with information about a man seen near the Vale estate 2 years earlier. When the detective spoke Derek Moreno's name, the world tilted so violently I had to grab the wall to stay upright. Adrian turned toward me, shock and fury colliding in his eyes, and I shook my head, denying it even as memories slammed into place. Derek's sudden appearance at the shelter, his talk of leverage, his knowing smirk. 2 days later, Derek was in custody, pale and sweating behind the glass of an interrogation room, his bravado crumbling under the weight of his own words as he admitted he'd used a wandering child as an opportunity and then discarded him when things became complicated. Listening to him speak, I felt something inside me finally break free, not into rage but into clarity. The man I had married was a stranger, and the guilt I'd carried for years evaporated in that sterile room. When I walked away from him, I didn't look back. The final custody ruling came a week later, and this time the courtroom felt different, lighter, as if the truth had aired it out. The judge acknowledged my actions as compassionate and responsible, words that filled my eyes with tears I didn't bother hiding. Adrian was granted full legal custody as Julian's biological father, a decision that landed with both relief and grief. But the judge continued, granting me ongoing visitation and encouraging shared involvement in his life. Julian squeezed my hand and whispered that he'd always see me, and I kissed his forehead, promising him that some bonds don't require paperwork to endure. Afterward, Adrian approached me quietly and said that family isn't always about blood, that sometimes it's about choice. And for the first time since I'd met him, his words didn't feel guarded. Months passed, and life settled into something gentler. Julian thrived with therapy and routine, growing taller and steadier, rediscovering joy in books and mornings that didn't begin with fear. Adrian offered me a position with the Vail Foundation, working with children who slipped through the cracks the way Julian once had, and I found a small apartment that was warm and mine. Julian helped me hang curtains, his laughter filling the rooms, and one afternoon, curled beside me on the couch, he asked if he could have 2 families. I told him he already did, and when he rested his head on my shoulder and said I'd saved him, I felt the quiet certainty of a life rebuilt on love rather than loss. I used to believe family was something assigned to you at birth, a fixed address you returned to no matter how far you wandered. But standing in my small living room months later, sunlight spilling across secondhand furniture and dust motes floating like they finally had nowhere urgent to be, I understood how wrong I'd been. Julian sat cross-legged on the floor sorting through books Adrian had brought over, carefully lining them up by size the way he did when his mind needed order, and every so often he'd glance up at me as if checking that I was still there, that I hadn't quietly slipped out of his world now that things were easier. Adrian stood near the window, hands in his pockets, no longer the towering, untouchable figure from magazine covers, but a father learning how to inhabit ordinary moments again, learning how to share space rather than control it. There was an unspoken understanding between us, a respect forged not by contracts or apologies, but by the shared knowledge of what it meant to almost lose everything. Julian's life began to take on the shape of stability slowly, gently, the way you let an injured animal approach you on its own terms. Therapy helped him untangle memories that arrived without warning, and school gave him a rhythm that grounded him. He joined a reading club and discovered he loved stories where children found hidden strength in impossible circumstances, stories that mirrored his own journey in quiet ways. Adrian learned to slow down, to sit through bedtime conversations without checking his phone, to listen when Julian talked about small fears and even smaller victories. As for me, working with the foundation filled a space inside me I hadn't known was empty, allowing me to turn years of fear and survival into something that might make another child's path a little less cruel. I moved into a modest apartment near the city, nothing extravagant, but it was warm, safe, and mine. and for the first time in a long while, I slept through the night. One afternoon, Julian climbed onto the couch beside me, the way he always did when a question weighed on him. He traced the seam of the cushion thoughtfully before asking, "Grace, do you think it's okay if I have two families?" The question tightened my chest in that familiar way love does when it brushes against loss. I asked him what he meant, and he explained carefully, pointing to himself, that he wanted a family with his dad and another with me, as if afraid one might cancel out the other. I pulled him close and told him the truth, that families aren't divided by love, they're expanded by it, and that there was no rule saying his heart had to choose. He rested his head on my shoulder and said, "I love you," with the certainty of someone who has learned the cost of saying it too late. And I felt tears gather, not sharp this time, but warm and steady. Looking back, I can see how close I came to letting fear dictate my choices, how easy it would have been to look away in that hospital waiting room, to decide my pain was too heavy to carry someone else's. If I had, Julian might still be lost to the cracks between systems and indifference, and I would still be measuring my worth by the things I lost instead of the lives I touched. Love didn't save us because it was loud or dramatic. It saved us because it stayed. It stayed through rain and suspicion and courtrooms and headlines that twisted truth into spectacle. It stayed when it would have been easier to disappear. The night Julian hugged me outside the courthouse for the last time before going home with Adrian, he whispered, "You're my other mom." And in that moment, every cold floor, every sleepless night, every ounce of doubt found its answer. I began this journey with nothing. No home, no partner, no safety net. But in losing everything I thought defined me, I found something far greater. I found proof that family is chosen, built in moments of fear and courage, held together by promises kept when no one is watching. It's the hand you refuse to let go of in the rain, the child who trusts you when the world has taught him not to, the people who stay even when staying costs them something. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that compassion still matters in a world that often rewards indifference, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what this story meant to you.